another episode of the Teens Armored Podcast. This episode, we're going to be talking about the Reformed Baptist. I'm Chris, and I'm here with Hayden. How's it going, Hayden?
Is
The
going fantastic.
the most Reformed of the Baptists that I know.
Mara. That's probably true.
Yeah, yep. And how's your week been? First off,
It's been good. Last week of school. So, last week of the winter semester of high school, bro. Crazy.
that's true.
We about to skedaddle for real.
I mean, now that's crazy. One semester left, and then we're off.
Yeah, it's crazy to think we have finals tomorrow. I'm definitely gonna study tomorrow, trust.
Yep, we're gonna study for tests, and then we're gonna become smart, and
Mm.
we're gonna be smart Baptists, maybe
Mm-hmm.
even learn some theology, and that would mean we're Reformed Baptists.
Ooh.
Today, we are going to be talking about just that the Reformed Baptists. There's a lot of ideas that people have of the Reformed Baptist,
Mm-hmm.
and there are a lot of people who call themselves Reformed Baptists. So, we're going to address that. For example, we would probably refer to ourselves as Reformed Baptists on this podcast.
No.
So, we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about 4 questions. We're going to talk about the Reformed tradition. What does it mean to be Reformed? What are Reformed Baptists, which is the main point, and then we're going to talk about if Baptists can even be Reformed.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start off with talking about the Reformed tradition. Now, a little bit of context. You have Luther, who's a reformer. He reformed the Catholic Church. We had a whole episode on Protestantism and stuff like that. So,
Mm-hmm.
and then we see other reformers after him, like John Calvin. And John Calvin is actually, he's like a father to the Reformed tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, Westminster, which is where these reformed that come after Calvin they meet. Westminster is really, really famous because a lot of Presbyterians quote it.
I think what you're saying is very interesting, Chris, because the term reformed can be a very broad term. It could be a very tent term, and then it can be very specific. There are three classifications to it that I've found. So the first classification is the lowercase r reformed, is what we're going to call it. So we're going to call it lowercase r. This refers to like Protestant. So you have churches like the Reformed Episcopal Church, for example, the REC. Okay, that reformed doesn't refer to reformed as in John Calvin, even though they would probably hold to a more Calvinistic view of Anglican theology. That reformed there refers more to Protestant because, it's the Protestant Reformation. The term reformed came from the Reformation, right? It's just the quote unquote capital R Reformed tradition kind of held to it. And so that's where you find like the Reformed tradition really kind of comes into the fact that it's not Lutheran. So you have you have Zwingli and you have Luther, right? And so Zwingli and Luther they would have this big debate over sacramentology. We might get into this later as well. And actually how Zwingli what he was debating wasn't necessarily memorialism, even though he held to it. It was more of where is Christ's body now? And Zwingli says it's in heaven. It can't be in bread. And Calvin would later on go, correct, you're correct, Zwingli, but also that is not what we're arguing when we say Christ is present. So I think that's interesting. But you ha
Yeah.
the quote unquote capital R Reformed tradition kind of comes from the fact that it's not necessarily the Lutheran tradition. Both of them have distinct differences in how they understand Christology, but they both are Protestant. So that's the second one. And then you kind of have third qualification where it's like, a lot of the traditions that come out of Calvin, right? So, you have the Presbyterians, the French Reformed, Dutch Reformed, right? But like even, if you're to count that, then Calvin taught a lot of people. I mean, he taught Knox, so the Presbyterians, but he also helped with a lot of Cranmer's theology. So a lot of the Anglicans. Fun fact, the Westminster Confession is actually an expansion on the 39 Articles. It has a few differences, right? There's a few differences in church polity and things like that. But I just think it's interesting to think that Anglican theology actually has some pretty close ties with the Reformed, though they are distinct enough now, and I think they were distinct even in the time. But they do have this sort of connection, which I think is interesting. Another interesting thing is the Puritans, right? A little bit later on in
Puritans.
English history. Yeah, and they're also within the English church. They're not necessarily Presbyterians. They're all actually Anglicans. until they separated from the Church of England. Um, and yeah, they were seeking another English Reformation because they thought the church was corrupt. The priests lived like kings, and they were immoral and hypocrites. So the Puritans, they split off, and that's why you see a lot of hellfire and brimstone. That's why they're kind of Congregationalist. Um, so it's very
Right.
interesting. Defining the Reformed tradition is so interesting, and you also have the particular Baptist. Now that's the real debate we'll get into later. Is our Baptist Reform? But I think if you go by the third definition of the broad tent, I think we could go ahead and put particular Baptist in this whole thing. So it's very interesting. And another thing we not to neglect is actually the unity between all the Protestant traditions, because Melanchthon, who was a very influential on Luther, was also influential on Calvin. A lot of people consider Melanchthon to be the father of the Reformed tradition, and actually Luther and Calvin are very similar, especially on what people would define Reformed tradition now, like maybe as Calvinism. Luther, one of the reasons for Luther starting the Reformation, for sola fide, was actually on his theology of the will. You can read his book, Bondage of the Will, in which he argues that the will is bound until Christ sets it free. And what he's trying to say there is that we cannot attain our own salvation. That's what he was going against Rome with. That's the sola fide. It's by faith alone. And he was arguing that it can only be brought about through Christ. So really, there is a big unity between all the Protestants and a lot of their theology.
I would just like to spend a moment to clarify. The Presbyterians have their church government. So just to clarify some of the terms that you mentioned,
Hmm.
you got the Presbyterians, and then their government is, it's got hierarchy. It's a little bit more. It's a little bit less like the Catholic view where you got
Yeah.
the big Pope on the top, and then it kind of flows down from there. It's a little bit more from the bottom up. And then
Hmm.
you've got the Congregationalists, which rely more on the congregation to make decision. So it's led by the members of the church rather than leaders making all the decisions.
Yeah. It's elder led, but the congregation votes upon issues. Yeah.
Yeah, and you do see different instances of that today.
Hmm.
There are some Congregationalist churches that rely more on elders, and there are some Congregationalist churches that, if they want to change the curtains, they got to have a vote on it. So
Yeah.
we'll see different degrees of that, but the idea pretty much stays the same of under the banner of Congregationalism. And yeah, I mean, you could even argue that maybe there's people who believe that only Presbyterians own the title Reformed tradition, and
Hmm.
Puritans don't count.
Hmm.
And I think, I mean, it comes from an understanding of how strict you hold to the term reformed, and that's where
Yeah.
we see most of the debate coming in later.
Hmm.
Of can Baptists be reformed?
Yeah.
Other things like that.
Yeah. Well, what I think is interesting with the argument, like our Presbyterians are the only reformed, like they came a lot later than a lot of these other people, like I mentioned. Like sure, they came before the Puritans and before the Anglicans, but there were other groups like the Huguenots, the French Reformed, were much before them. And you don't see anyone talking about the Huguenots as like, holding the title of Reformed. And sure, like the Presbyterians had a lot of similar theology to Calvin, same thing with the Dutch Reformed and the Hungarian Reformed, right? But so do a lot of the Puritans. It's up until about Congregationalism, right? It's congregation like church polity is their only difference, and how big you want to make that a difference separates the debate on how can they hold the title reformed. Anglicans are about the same way. I would say the more Anglicans now, it's their theology was never made to be, strictly reformed, right? They were always given looseness. They kind of have this quote unquote via media between Reformed and Lutheran, on a lot of issues such as church polity, for example. But you can see a lot of Calvin's influence in a lot of how they view things, such as the real presence in Lord's Supper. The Anglicans would hold to a spiritual presence view, and Cranmer got a lot of his theology from Calvin, especially Calvin's Christology. So I just think that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, just to clarify the term spiritual presence and real presence. So the debate is on. So there's a Catholic view of transubstantiation, which is where they believe that they're essentially the priest who turns the body and blood. He gets that from the Eucharist. So the bread
Yeah,
and the
it's
wine
a
turns into it.
physical transformation.
It's believed
Yeah.
to be a physical transformation. And Protestants hold that to be very dangerous. As a matter of fact, the London Baptist Confession calls
Hmm.
it a very terrible thing for attempting to re-crucify Christ.
Yeah.
And then you have Lutheran view, which is that it's Christ's body and blood is already in there. And then
Mm-hmm.
you have a Zwinglian view, which says it's more like a memory. We're
Mm-hmm.
remembering it, and you do see that Zwinglian view being held by a lot of regular Baptist churches.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it's not as if that's a Baptist distinctive
Yeah,
because the
exactly.
particular Baptists didn't even hold to that. They believed
Mm-hmm.
in there was a form of real presence, but it was more spiritual, and
Yeah.
we believe that Christ's body is still in heaven.
Yeah, I want to interject. Oh, sorry. I want to interject here real quick on the Zwinglian view. What's interesting is that Zwingli was a lot more lenient towards real presence than a lot of people are today. So his view was his thing with Luther is he just couldn't say that Christ's body was present. Or he's like, no, his body is in heaven. It's not in and under the bread. That's what he was really fighting against with a lot of his stuff. And this is kind of why, people are like, oh, he said real presence at the end of his life. Really, what I would say is that from what he's kind of saying, it's that he's kind of coming to this conclusion of what Calvin would come to later, and what he would exposit is that like Christ's body, and this is the spiritual presence view, it's not locally present, but it is spiritually present, and that's that idea that he would be more lenient to, but maybe around the end of his life, with a lot of other influences coming in. So I just think that's super interesting.
I mean, all this talk about Reformed tradition, it should lead us to the question: what does it mean to even be Reformed? I mean, what are the
Yeah.
Reformed doctrines that many hold to? Because we already
Hmm.
talked about the spiritual presence in the Lord's Supper, but there's more
Yeah.
than that. I mean, there's emphasis on authority of Scripture
Hmm.
rather than
The big
authority of
big
tradition.
emphasis.
Yeah,
Hmm.
very big influence. I mean, emphasis, especially compared for the time there was the Reformation. So you've got the Catholic view, which actually holds authority very high, and the Reform view says no, Scripture should be held highly.
Hmm.
And you got the five solas. You got faith alone, Christ alone, Scripture alone, glory to God alone. Did I say four solas?
You said four of them. You forgot Grace.
Grace
Grace
alone,
alone. Yeah.
grace alone. I don't know why I did that. But yeah, these are typically associated with evangelicals as the five solas of the Reformation. Because even
Hmm.
though I mean you could argue it's not explicitly stated by reformers like Luther, but it's the idea that's found
Yeah. Yeah.
underlying the whole principle of reform. And the whole principle comes down to semper reformanda, or always
Always
reforming.
reforming. Hmm.
And that's why we always want to be reforming, because we have a tendency as humans to deform
Hmm.
Christianity and deform the church. And so that's entirely the point of the Reformed tradition and Reformed doctrines. And again, there's the big one, the doctrines of grace,
Yeah.
predestination. That's a big talking point, especially during the Young Restless and Reform movement. That's what
Hmm.
brought that's what brought the Presbyterians and the particular Baptists. Boom! Now you've got Calvinistic Baptists, and you got a whole movement around
Yeah.
it, and it's really a good natured movement.
Hmm. I do think that I mean, when it comes to YRR, Young, Restless, and Reformed, I do think it's interesting because it did really shift a lot of the terminology. You can like see like towards the time, yeah, you do see a shift in terminology, but that's where like it becomes definite that this means this. I feel like it was at that point that like the term, Calvinist referred more to doctrines of grace, soteriology, rather than a denomination or a tradition. You also see, terms like Reformed Baptist being thrown around more often. And also the term, like, what, the term reform, like, what does that mean? Like the tent post has been a little bit broadened more than maybe it was originally. But once again, we'll get back into that whole debate later on. So I do think it's interesting, and I do really like what YRR did, but at the same time, I do think it dumbed down a lot of Reformed doctrine into just Calvinism. Um, and I think we see that as well with the new Calvinism movement kind of coming out of that, or with that. Is
True.
that it does seem to be that Calvinism is just these five or even sometimes 4 points. And it's kind of we lost a lot of the richness of Reformed theology and a lot of other stuff within it, and it was just all kind of dumbed down to Calvinism. Not to say that the doctrines of grace are not stellar on their own, but at the same time we also had some pretty sloppy interpretations of them. I mean, we see that now with people, new Calvinists on X or whatever, saying crazy stuff that does not align with Reformed theology. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's just kind of what I
exactly.
have to say on YRR. Um,
Yeah, and it blended the questions of church government, covenant theology, and baptism. And now looking at these
Hmm.
three, I mean, there's church government, which is first, again, question of can you still be congregationalist and still be part of the Reformed tradition or still be Reformed?
Hmm.
Again, I think most would say yes, you could allow it because
Yeah.
Puritans, but
Hmm.
the real question comes down to covenant theology. Because I mean, the thought is that often that baptism is separate from this, separate of how you view God's usage of the covenants of his promises throughout
Hmm.
scriptures. One of the things that we forget is covenant theology is what builds the Baptist view for particular Baptists on
Hmm.
baptism.
Yeah.
It's the view of how the covenants came to be rather than seeing the question would be, are we born into the covenant through birth or through new birth? I
Hmm.
mean, if it's through birth, then infant baptism makes much more sense. If it's through new birth,
Hmm.
then we would expect you wouldn't be baptized, so you wouldn't maybe have the sign and seal of
Hmm.
the covenant that we see from Christ, unless you were born again. And we don't want to have a bunch of people with the sign of the covenant who aren't part of the covenant. So
Exactly.
we want to minimize that as much as possible. And that's where the real debate really truly comes from. Although
Hmm.
you will see more layperson debates in non-particular Baptists who argue from it's their personal choice and
Hmm.
other different arguments like that. That's what we see mostly coming from the definition of reformed. That's where the debate lies in the covenant theology and baptism part.
Hmm.
And besides that, particular Baptists actually agree with
Oh yeah.
the rest of the reformed on a ton of stuff,
Hmm.
especially when you read the 1689 next to the Westminster.
Yeah.
It was
There's a lot
greatly
of agreement.
inspired by it.
Hmm.
A lot came from that.
Now, what I think is interesting here, I'll jump in here for a second. So, there was another confession mimicked after the Westminster. It was actually a General Baptist confession, and it was actually a little bit different because 1689 Westminster have chapters. This one has articles, so it doesn't have chapters and then articles in the chapters. It has almost around. It's a big number. There was like 60 or something articles in it, but most of them are based off of the Westminster. And it came a year after 1689, so that's interesting. It's called an Orthodox Creed or the Orthodox Creed. You can just look up the Orthodox Creed Baptist online. You can probably find somewhere to read it. It's very interesting. It's actually a very well done confession. It has a lot of stuff that 1689 doesn't have because it's mimicking Westminster, like a stuff about the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, and how that is a good thing to have and a good thing to confess as Christians, and it should be the normative of faith, or like a creed that no church should or churches should be willing to submit to, which I thought was super interesting. There's a lot of really cool stuff in there. But what I think is most interesting is that reading that side by side with Westminster, you see a lot more disagreement in just little things than you do with 1689. And both serve the same purpose to show their quote unquote unity, right, with the Reformed Church. But the General Baptist had a lot more disagreement with Westminster, obviously because of um, their nature of how they would view things like the doctrines of grace and their Christology and their view of God and His sovereignty. So that was really, I thought that was actually really interesting. And if anything, it showed there is a lot of unity between this particular set of Baptists than there was with a lot of the other general church. So
Yeah, I mean, and look at their descendants too. Look at the descendants of the Reformed or the particular Baptists, and you'll see a
hmm.
lot of communion with Presbyterians.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at the descendants of General Baptists, less so. You see less confessionalism. You see they
Hmm.
don't hold to their roots as strongly. I think it would be nice if they did, but unfortunately they don't.
No,
And
yeah.
you could say that the descendants of that even come down to, mega church
Hmm.
type structures. But I mean, yeah, it just goes to show how closely connected we actually are, even if some would not consider us part of their group.
I do think it is very interesting the fact that how most of the particular Baptists, remained confessional. They remain, I mean, even today, they remain to have a different liturgy. Their liturgy is more traditional. Not to say that they, just use a cappella or piano. They use a variety of instruments, but they utilize it in a way that is traditional, in a way that honors God first and focuses on congregational worship more than, rock band and TED Talk, even though that's a straw man, but you get what I'm trying to say. I have this
Yeah.
doc pulled up. I created this in August. So I wanted to have on my phone a notes app with every single Baptist confession and catechism to hopefully turn into a personal book that I can make, which I thought would be really cool. But I'm realizing that's really hard. So on this doc, I have a list of every confession and catechism. So I think this is very interesting information. So the fact that there are 26 total Baptist confessions, 18 of them are particular Baptist confessions, eight of
Hmm.
them are general Baptist confessions. There are a total of 11 catechisms, and there are nine particular Baptist catechisms, two general Baptist catechisms. And what's interesting is that as you look through this list, you have like a solid amount in the 17th century on both sides, but you get to the 18th century and it's just particular Baptist, particular Baptist, particular Baptist, particular Baptist. And then only in the 19th century, you get a general Baptist confession and a catechism, but it's mainly predominantly particular Baptists that are predominantly the ones that are being confessional. And we can talk about the confessions later on, but I do think it is interesting that you see this unity and this love for the Reformed tradition and tradition in general, and kind of keeping in step, setting up those guardrails, right? That's what we're talking about with tradition is it's those guardrails from heresy, and just setting them up. I do think that was very influential in the reason
Right.
why we see the particular Baptists have stayed the way they have for so long. And I sympathize for my General Baptist brothers. I do think they have some rich history and tradition. I just don't think they have kept in the same way. And not to say that there are not smart General Baptists out there or not traditional General Baptists. I believe they're out there somewhere, but they are very, very rare. And I do think it is because of how they have viewed tradition and confessions in the way that they haven't set up these borders for what to do, and now they've kind of wandered into whatever it is cool for the period, and that's how their theology works. So I do think that's interesting. We've kind of gotten our rabbit trail, Chris. I think we should maybe move back to the question at hand is on what it means to be reformed.
I mean, that's pretty much all I would have to say on it as far as we go for Reformed Baptist. I'm ready to move on to the next section when you are.
Yeah, I guess I just have a few thoughts to kind of say. I think so. R.C. Sproul has a book. It's called "What Is Reformed Theology?" Very good book. One of the first theological books I read. And in that he defines it as five solas. So Scripture alone, Christ alone, faith alone, grace alone, glory of God alone. And he really goes in on that. And what's interesting is that the Reformed view actually has a distinctive on each of those in a way. An example of that is the sufficiency of Scripture is taken differently. Think about the regulative principle, for example, right? Other traditions, yeah, don't have the regulative principle of worship.
Yeah, the regular principle of worship, just to explain, understanding that there, rather than having normative ways of worshiping, whereas we worship as long as the Bible doesn't explicitly forbid it, we only worship in ways that is commanded. So if it says to meet in prayers, we meet with prayers. If it says sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, we sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And if it says to do so orderly, then we do so orderly. We try not to become like Pentecostals, and we try to
Hmm.
keep things formal and respectful and reverent. That's
Yeah.
different from the normative principle, which you see in most churches, which in extreme examples, you do see the mega church smoke
Yeah.
mirrors and the rock concert. And on the other side, you do see, interestingly enough, I didn't realize this until I started, doing more research on Catholicism, is that they Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy both do not hold to the regulative principle because they believe tradition will guide their worship.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting. They also have like a particular Christology, and this is really what leads to the debate of the real presence with Zwingli and Luther, and later on Calvin, is that Christology leads to that whole sacramental debate. So that's super interesting. Um, And then, of course, emphasis on the sovereignty of God and, how that balances between human responsibility and eternal sovereignty, right? That is, God's grace. So even within the solas, you see there are little ways that the Reformed interpret it that I would consider a correct interpretation. But that doesn't mean that, they're more Protestant than these other groups. I would just say they have their own ways of, you know, um, extrapolating these truths of Protestantism. Another thing he talked about was covenant theology, which I think is a very important thing to have as if you are reformed. It is that law gospel distinction, which once again is a difference from the Lutherans. They would have a different law gospel distinction where they make that their central part of their theology, which is where we differ, in how the gospel and grace work together. And so once again, there's the debate we'll get to later of, what kind of covenant theology, is it Baptist? Is it Westminsterian? That's the thing. So there's also that. And then there's also the doctrines of grace and Calvinism, which is actually a lot. Going through the book, that was about more than half of the book is talking about the doctrines of grace, which covers a lot like, sovereignty, man's sin, total, stuff like total depravity, soteriology, et cetera, view of the atonement. So, all that stuff really is very important to Reformed theology. Um, yeah, and even for soteriology, it's like, what is the extent? Is it our 4-point Calvinists, also known as Amyraldians? They deny limited atonement. Um, they're also called hypothetical universalists, I believe. Are they within Reformed theology? Are they Reformed? So there's also that debate. And even I think another good thing to add here that I think RC leaves out, but there's a lot of debate here, so I don't know. I think it is kind of appropriate that he leaves this out. Um, he's real presence, spiritual presence, that is that flows from a distinctly reformed view, like I said about the Christology. But at the same time, even though that is a distinctly reformed view, you also have memorialists like Zwingli. Even though I talked about earlier how Zwingli was interpreting things, not to say that he wasn't memorialist, I do think he was a more memorialist. um I think he's also a lot different than a lot of modern memorialists. I think he was much better memorialist than a lot of modern ones are. But also with sacramentology of, infant baptism through covenant theology, and that's where Baptists would disagree. They would say, no, we have a different covenant theology. There are, the members of the church are only the believers, only those who are born again, only those the elect. So those are the people that we are to baptize. And so there's the difference there. And yes, there's another thing, another little disagreement. I think this one's kind of what we're talking about church government. The Puritans are Congregationalists, the Presbyterians have a Presbyterian structure. And you can also think of Reformed Anglicans like J.I. Packer. J.I. Packer is a very Reformed Anglican, a lot more than most are. Um, and I believe that he held to an Episcopal structure of government. So I think church government is honestly up for grabs. It really depends on, what denomination you're in. I don't think that necessarily defines Reformed theology, but I think what RC laid out here was pretty good. So I think we can go ahead and move on to the next question, Chris, if you're ready.
Yeah, I agree. I think we yapped enough on this point. I think just to summarize, we greatly respect other reformed, even if they might not consider us reformed. So moving on to the next point,
Mhm.
what are the Reformed Baptists? Okay, this is a point I was hoping we'd get to talk more about.
We can talk more about it.
When people think of the term Reformed Baptist, there's one thing that they associate with it, and that is Calvinism, the big bad Calvinism. You could think more traditionally of it. You could think of the Reform. You can think of the 1689, the 1644, and Keach's Catechism. Those are
Hmm.
typically what people associate with particular Baptist theology. The term is also used to refer to Calvinistic Baptists.
Hmm.
Reformed Baptists tend to be some of the most conservative Christians. I mean, saying a liberal Reformed Baptist sounds very oxymoronic.
Yeah.
And a lot of this comes from Young Restless and Reform movement, and you see
Hmm.
this view of biblical masculinity, and you also see strong connections to the SBC that a lot
Yeah.
of Reformed Baptist churches have.
Hmm.
It's one of the few American denominations to expel progressive theology. So interestingly enough, the SBC, unlike other longstanding denominations which have fractured because of theological liberalism, the SBC has been one of the few major denominations that was able to expel progressive theology and
Hmm.
made the progressive theologians essentially leave.
Hmm.
And as a
But
result,
it still has its problems though.
it still does have its problems. But most people know the SBC for being conservative.
Hmm.
That's a lot of where some of that comes from too. SBC influence, and they have a lot of influence in the SBC. There's also the founding of modern missions. So William Carey came from
Hmm.
this background. So most when you hear someone say, "Oh, they're going on a mission," they typically go somewhere. Maybe it's a safe country, maybe it's a not safe country, maybe it's somewhere dangerous, and they're putting their
Hmm.
lives on the line for the sake of proclaiming the gospel in countries where it's restricted, banned, or they're under dangerous influence.
Hmm.
And we can thank William Carey, a particular Baptist, for this whole modern idea of missions.
Yeah.
So again, there's a strong emphasis of the gospel that you see within the Reformed Baptist tradition. And now let's take a moment to look at how other people view us. If you ask the high church, they'll look at us and say, "Oh, they're wannabes, they're fakes." The idea of a Reformed Baptist is just they want to be like us. they're just a bunch of fakers who want to have high liturgy and who want to have tradition, but they just are bad at it. And then if you ask evangelicals, they'll say, "Oh, those Reformed Baptists." Some of them will say they're strict, and some of them will say there's no Holy Spirit. Especially Pentecostals have a high tendency to say that Reformed Baptists have no Holy Spirit in their church.
Hmm.
Even though the Holy Spirit, our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, they would say because we're not, dancing that we do not have it. But again, um, both of those are not truly what we believe. I mean, we hold
Hmm.
to our confessions because that's what has come back from a long tradition of confessions,
Hmm.
not because we want to be like Big Brother, Anglican, Lutheran, Presbyterian. We do it because that's what we believe.
Hmm.
And we believe it's what aligns with Semper Reformanda, always reforming. I mean, let's go
Hmm.
back 2,000 years to the apostles. Now, I genuinely believe, I mean this entirely, a particular Baptist church would align most with the theology of the apostles in modern day. And if you say that to a Catholic or to an Orthodox or any high churcher, they just laugh at you. They think that's completely preposterous. Let's take a moment to actually look at this. I mean, on in the church, we don't see any icons. We do see symbolism. There's been early
Hmm.
churches found with symbols like the fish.
The fish and the ishtys, yeah.
Yes, the Ishtis and the cross and the but there's no icons. I mean, there's no true icons. There's symbolism, and symbolism points us to the thing, but you never stare at a symbol and get lost in the symbol itself. You always see it, briefly glance at it, and it points to the thing. In similar
Hmm.
ways, particular Baptists do not allow icons, but you will see symbolism. You will see a lot of images of the cross.
Hmm.
There's also no concrete evidence of infant baptism. It's not even really mentioned until the mid third century, and then in the fourth century, it didn't become a standard practice until the fourth century.
Hmm.
So before then, you see strong believers baptism. You
Hmm.
don't see a formal church hierarchy from the apostles. Close enough to that is congregationalism that we have.
Hmm. It's very. I think one can make an argument. It's very close to congregationalism. It may have a higher view of elders. And some would say, oh, that means bishops. I would say elder and bishop are synopsis here. Um, but I do think that with how the church not only autonomously worked, but it also worked with elders in mind, that there were all these autonomous churches, but they all were in communion with each other, and yet they were all under the leadership of the elders in the church. I do think that's you. It's not like modern congregationalism, just in the same way that maybe their credo baptism is not like modern credo baptism. But I would still say that not only is it credo baptism, I would say it's in a way congregationalism, maybe an early form of it. So.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's it too, that we see it. It's sort of like a mirror or a reflection of it.
Hmm.
That's why I would say it's the purest form of Semper Reformanda, of always reforming. Um, and you see gathering together for um, there's proof of them gathering together for prayers and breaking bread. In other words, communion, and then psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And again, you see mentioning of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. We see some of these evidences in Acts. We see, how closely it resembles, simplistic view of church. Um, I would argue that yes, one of the closest things you can get to the teachings and way it was structured is found in particular Baptist churches. I mean, even a Bible church would be pretty close with this emphasis on Scripture.
Hmm.
If you can see a lot of close resemblance. I mean, and it's funny too because again, Reformed Baptists are often seen from high church view as lesser
Yeah.
beings that have strayed so far from the history of the church. It's like the 2,000 years argument. I mean,
Hmm.
just look at the apostles and see the close resemblance. So again, I still hold by that when I believe that Reformed Baptist theology is the closest you can get
Hmm.
denominational wise to the early church.
Yeah. And I do think when it comes to, I mean, the early church, you have to just think of the time period, right? And with the time period, I remember reading this interesting argument. It's like, what would Catholicism look like now if Constantine had never become Christian? Like, how would the church institutionally operate? Not theologically. Theologically, the church was always the church the way it is. I'm not gonna let some Mormon twist what I'm saying here and be like, oh, he's agreeing with me that Constantine founded Trinitarian
Constantine invented
Christianity.
Christianity. He
Yeah,
invented
yeah, no, no, no.
Christianity.
I'm saying institutionally and how it operates. And I do think it's another thing with the early church, how would it operate? It operated in a different time, in a different period, right? With different things. It's like the same way I made this argument one time that all right, I think a lot of people would agree that if Augustine was brought into the current period, he would probably be reformed. Now, would he be reformed Anglican or reformed? Like, I don't know, but he would be more reformed. And I know this because a lot of Augustine's theology is similar to Calvin's and a lot of his students, right? Melanchthon, people like that. And so, you know, it's just the period of time, right? We can't go back and be like, oh, Augustine is reformed, but we can say Augustine, if he were brought into the modern period, he probably would be called reformed, and we could probably call him reformed that way. In the same way, I would agree with you, Chris. I would say that denominationally, particular Baptists, and I would say Protestants in general are closer to the church, but I would say particular Baptists, and this is just my opinion from looking at church history, I think the particular Baptists are probably the closest denominationally to the apostles. And a lot of people will be like, oh, that's crazy, all that stuff. But I mean, this is just what I'm seeing when I view church history. Like, I agree. They would be like, oh, they didn't baptize or not baptize infants for the same reasons that y'all don't. I'm like, that's true, but they still didn't baptize infants. And then it's like, what about the majority of church history? Are you denying that all the baptisms were done improperly, or whatever, or like invalid? I would say the baptisms done to infants up until particular Baptists, I would say they're not invalid, but I would say they are improper in the same way that with medieval Roman Catholicism and even sometimes today with the withholding of the wine from the laity, right?
Exactly.
Are we to say that that sacrament is invalid? That there are we to say that Christ is not present there? Right? Are we to say that they are not spiritually feasting on Christ? Spiritual presence view, right? That sacrament is invalid just because they have the bread and they're being withheld the wine. No, but it is improper. It is an improper administration, but the realistic thing is still behind it, right? There are still believers who were baptized. Um,
Right.
there are still infants who were baptized and then came to faith later on, right? And there are also some who did not. But the point still stands that what is really there is under there. And so I think that yeah, I would say I would agree with you, Chris. I think that is true. But at the same time, I also would say, it's hard to say one denomination is exactly like that. That's not what we're trying to say. We're not trying to say our denomination was founded 2,000 years ago. No,
We are the
what
one
we're
true
saying is that,
church.
yeah, we're not saying we're the one true church, but we're saying that what we're trying to do within our theology, and this is theology we agree with, is be as close to that as possible. And that's where we draw the line. And ultimately, it's through Scripture, and we're just seeing how both churches interpret Scripture and seeing the parallels there. So, and I think a lot of churches can claim, oh, we were this close to the apostles, we were this close to the apostles or the church fathers, and that's just because the church fathers disagreed on stuff. So you can pull one quote and then pull another quote. But I do think that, from my opinion, that I would agree with you, Chris, here. So,
I mean, and you hear the straw man too that Baptists believe that the church had a dead sacrament for thousands of years up
yeah,
until
and
Baptists arrived. In.
and the counter to that is to be a landmark Baptist and believe in the Trail of Blood, which is just a string of pearls. I mean, if you look at it, like I've looked at it and I've seen a lot of people talk about it on both sides, and it's just, I agree, it's a string of pearls. So, but that's not what we're trying to say. So you can continue on, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. That's all I have to add on this part. If you can finish up what you're saying.
Yeah, I was gonna go more into like the theological nature. I'm glad you touched on more like historical stuff there, because I mean, what is a Reformed Baptist? I think it's really hard to define because the term Reformed Baptist is a modern term. The historical name, as we mentioned a bunch of times, is particular Baptist. Now, this refers to a Baptist that believes in a particular atonement. This means, we're talking about limited atonement, right? Christ died for the elect, right? Whereas general Baptists were from a general atonement, it'd be like Christ died for the whole world. And so, all right, the term Reformed Baptist only came out in the later end of the 20th century. And this is when modern Baptists were seeking to retrieve or reform to their historic theology. And so the term can mean a lot of things. And I think that here are the top three things I think the term meant in the time. It could refer to an allyship with the broad Reformed tradition, so Protestants, like lowercase r Reformed. Um, as well as the specific Reformed tradition, as in Calvin, but it could also be referring to reforming back to historic theology, I think this is unlikely, but I do like the way that if it was used like that, I do think that would be a very good usage. I think really what it's referring to here is allyship with Calvinistic theology, as in Calvin, not the
Right.
doctrine of grace necessarily, though that's how it's kind of been interpreted. So theologically, Reformed Baptists are distinct from the General Baptists because of their views on Christology, soteriology, understanding of God's sovereignty and man's sin, law and gospel, covenant distinction, or use of covenant theology, and their sacramentalism most of the time. By that I mean historically, Reformed Baptists have affirmed real presence. Nowadays, it's kind of a lenient issue, and I'll get onto that in a minute. So yeah, I mean most of those things I just listed. What I was trying to do is mimic the that we agree with the Reformed view of the five solas. So all that is entailed with that. We agree with the Reformed on their view on Calvinism, so things like that. But where we disagree is covenant theology, and then if you want to count congregationalism. But yeah, so I think the 1689 is a good parameter to what is a Reformed Baptist. I think it's a good definition because it is a very well thought out document, and it is a Baptist version of a Reformed document, that would being the Westminster, and it shows a lot of allyship as well as the disagreements being church polity and covenant theology, as we've mentioned several times. But not a lot of people strictly hold to the 69. I think it's a really cool, fun conversation here, Chris. Is how can we define people as Reformed Baptists, or can we
Right.
define them if they disagree with 1689? So the first thing that I mentioned here, and this one's kind of like a up in the air, is someone a Reformed Baptist if they are a progressive covenantalist? So a little background here. There are a few main covenant theologies, but the two primary ones within Reformed Baptist theology is 1689 federalism, which is a view of the covenants of God from the view of the 1689 gives, and progressive covenantalism. Now, both progressive covenantalism is a bit newer, but they're both pretty much the same thing. The only difference is how they view natural law. And it's not like in an extreme way. It only really boils down to what is their view on the Christian Sabbath. So Federalists, 69 Federalists, tend to be more Sabbatarian than progressive covenantalists. Progressive covenantalists tend to say that, Christ is the Sabbath, but they would still view the Christian Sabbath as a day of worship and stuff like that. Whereas Federalists they have a wide range. You could either be super strict on the Sabbath, right? Where it's like, no running, no eating out, stuff like that. Or they could be more, this is a divine institution of a day. It is a day of rest, a day set apart to where we are to not partake in. So the real debate between Federalists is what does it mean in the 1689 clause on this Article 8? What does it mean to separate from the days of work, right? What does that mean to what are we supposed to do to separate this from a normal day, right? And does that mean that we can, cook the same way or do the same thing?
Right. And on one side, you see the puritanical, um, puritanical, not in a negative sense of the term. I don't mean to discount the Puritans, but they were a little too strict on things. And on the other side, you see it more, it's loosely affirmed. Whereas you kind of set it aside mentally. It's more of a mental thing. You basically can do most of the stuff as long as you don't work too hard. You should be fine. And it's just a question of it's just a large question of discernment that comes down to this and how we handle this the problem of the Sabbath. I've known some people to go farther on one side, and I've known some people who happen to rely on a looser view of the Sabbath.
Hmm.
Depending, it just depends. So I think it's a subject more discernment.
I think giving my thoughts, I think those are good thoughts. I think giving my thoughts on this, I don't think this is necessarily an issue of is someone faithful to the 1689, or is someone a Reformed Baptist if they are progressive covenantalist and not a Federalist, because I think that both do the same thing. They both do the same thing, and that is that they both have the same theology that leads to credo baptism, and that is that the old covenant points toward fulfillment in the new covenant, right? Progressive covenantalists would say that all the covenants build up to the new covenant, and 69 federalism would say the old covenant points towards it. So they're saying the same thing. They're using different terminology, and it really boils down to how they view natural law, being Sabbatarianism. And I don't think that's much of a debate for being a Reformed Baptist. I think that you can be, you know, a looser Sabbatarian, or maybe not even a Sabbatarian at all, or a strict Sabbatarian and still be a Reformed Baptist. That's just my opinion. Maybe, that differs because a lot of the Reformed Baptists who wrote the 69 were pretty strict Sabbatarians. But at the same time, you know, the essence of the Christian Sabbath is still understood in both sides. So yeah, I think it was a pretty easy one to start with. Next is real presence and memorialism. Once again, with this one, I I think I think with um, this one's a tricky one for me because there are a lot of really strong Reformed Baptists who are memorialists, but at the same time, real presence is a very, very distinctly Reformed view. Um, so I think with this one, I think that I would say someone can still be a Reformed Baptist and not believe in real presence, but I would say that they are. I would use the term quote unquote like reformed-ish with this when it comes to sacramentology, just because it is a very, very key reformed view of real presence, and it ties into a lot of Christology, into a lot of sacramentology and stuff like that. I don't think that this is an issue in which someone could not be a Reformed Baptist if they hold it, but I do think that it is. I do think that it is a significant thing to be talking about. What do you have to
I
say about
think
this, Chris?
I think it promotes a looser view of the term too.
Hmm.
Makes more people. You see this degrading of the term Reformed Baptist. You see it with
Yeah.
referring more to strictly particular, strictly confessional in some cases, and in other cases you see it referring to someone who maybe believes in predestination. That's about it. I mean, I've seen
Hmm.
instances of people who call themselves Reformed who are very, very far from the actual Reformed tradition, and I think it fails to capture the spirit of the Reform movement. So I would say it's another failure to be more reformed.
Yeah.
And again, not saying that that's wrong, like you can't have that view, but if you do,
Hmm.
you have to acknowledge that you are falling short of the Reformed tradition in some way,
Hmm.
and that is distinctly Reformed thing too, because of how much emphasis there is on this within Reformed theology
Yeah. Hmm.
historically.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. For me, it comes down to, was Zwingli reformed when he was saying all the things he was saying with Luther, right? I do think
Right.
I think memorialism points towards real presence. I really do. Especially as Zwinglian view. I've talked about this a few times. So that's why I would say reformed-ish. I would say you can hold like because someone's got. I'm thinking of the example of someone holding to like all the core tenets of Reformed faith, and then they're memorialists. I would say they're reformed-ish. I don't think one little doctrine completely kicks them out. Um, but I do think this is an important one to talk about. So that's why I would say reform is. It's not like the fullness of the reformed faith. I don't know how really how to put it. I think you
Right.
put it much better earlier. And that's not a bad thing. Like you can believe in that. I would disagree with you, but like Chris said, you just have to understand that you're, not fully quote unquote reformed. I don't like how I'm saying that. I feel like you said it much.
It comes down to the whole spirit of the Reform movement and
Hmm.
how that applies. I mean, because too often the term reform is just used as purely just predestination when it's
Hmm.
much deeper and richer than
Yeah.
that. I mean, this is a little bit sidetracked, but that you could theoretically have a mega church that has smoke machines. They have a electric guitar service, and then maybe even they punt a football across the stage or a Bible as a football, and they do all these
Hmm.
things that you would consider non-reformed. As a matter of fact, very opposite, contrary to it. But if they
Hmm.
hold to predestination, all of a sudden they're under the reform banner. So I
Hmm.
would, generally speaking, promote a stricter usage of the term reformed. I would
Yeah.
most likely require confessionalism. But I don't
Hmm.
think that having one thing here is going to necessarily completely exclude you from being the reformed tradition. And we see examples like Zwingli.
Next is elder ruled versus elder led. So this is actually a really big one because a lot of the modern 1689 churches today, I'm referring to more of the kind of American Association of Reformed Baptists, stuff like that. They're typically elder ruled, which is interesting because it's more of a Presbyterian style of government, and with how the presbyteries work in a way. But it's like the presbyteries, but they're independent churches in a way. But they also do submit to the overall conference of the denomination. So it's difference. The difference between elder ruled and elder led is the elders have a lot more power than the congregation. In elder led, the elders have more power, and they can settle. They can settle like minor issues and stuff like that. But the congregation ultimately votes, but they are led by the elders. The elders are the authority within the church, but the church is still an authority. Um, and so I think with this one, um, I think that like you can I think you see this throughout particular Baptist history is that the early particular Baptists were elder led, they weren't elder ruled. But I do think that this is kind of a thing of, how do we interpret congregationalism? I don't think that elder ruled slash elder led, I don't think that that can make you reformed or not. I think this also kind of falls into real presence. It's more of like on this issue, probably more reformed-ish. I don't know. It really depends on, actually, not that. Sorry. It would depend on how like Reformed Baptist you are here. Because elder ruled would be more lenient to the Presbyterian position. So it's not even an issue of, how reformed are you? It's okay, well, how congregationalist are you?
Right.
on
I
this
mean,
on
and
this on this
the
one.
Puritans too.
Yeah, that too.
So that, I mean, that's a different distinction to draw because yeah,
Yeah.
I think it comes down to what's more effective rather than because I believe all of each of those can honor God in the
hmm
same way. I don't think one is in sin. I think
Yeah.
a lot of it comes down to practicality. And again, there can be cases where again you see extreme. I say extreme, but actually very common cases, such as
hmm
again going back to the higher church denominations, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy. They where authority becomes too much of incense and idol,
hmm
and it distracts from the authority of scripture. But for
hmm
the most part, I think it comes down to what's practical and what is
hmm
practical, what's proven to work. In a lot of cases, is congregationalism.
Yeah. What I do think is another thing to add here is that with elder ruled, we see a lot of practical things of today, especially within Baptists, with a lot of the elder ruled churches. Sometimes there's, a pastor who's in sin, and they're just not telling the congregation because it's this the elders are in rule. They're not in authority to the congregation. Whereas in elder led, they have authority, but if they step out of line, the congregation is going to come at them, right? And that's kind of what we see in the scripture, is
Right.
this authority system, which you can't get if you don't have this elder led. So yeah, I would say this one is not really like, I think both, it's not in sin, and I don't think it's like a term of reformed orthodoxy, but it's more of like how congregationalists are you. And I think you can interpret a lot of these things. You can interpret both in the 1689, except for real presence. This is going to be hard to fix and fit into the 1689. But
Yeah.
federalism and then Sabbatarianism, um, and elder rule versus elder led. You can interpret the 69 to say it, but you have to understand that the original 69 authors were pretty strict Sabbatarians. They were Federalists, and also they were elder led. Doesn't mean you can disagree with that, but that does mean that though the original authors were that. So yeah.
I mean, and you can see it works because here we are today,
Mm-hmm.
hundreds of years later, still holding to the same confession back in
Yeah,
1689.
exactly.
So, so I think elder led has proved itself quite a bit. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's quite practical.
It is. Yeah. All right. Next one is okay. This one's a bit more of a bigger debate. This one is Calvinist versus Amyraldian. So 5 point Calvinist versus 4 point Calvinist. This can also refer to not just limited atonement, but also preservation of the saints sometimes. I feel like those are the two big debated ones. Even though I feel like preservation of the saints follows more logically. I don't know how you would really hold that. We'll do more Amyraldian this time. Um, limited atonement versus hypothetical universalist. Are you more reformed if you hold to Calvinism or Amyraldianism? What do you think, Chris? I'm gonna throw this one to you first before I talk about this one.
I mean, I would argue that having all 5 points of quote unquote Calvinism is more reformed. It's much more, again, holding it back to the same idea that we want to generally have a stricter view of what it means to be reformed. Because
hmm
once we start loosening our grip on the term, we start to again see some unfortunate consequences from it. So I'll argue that they are, in a sense, lacking the fullness of the Reformed tradition. They're lacking the
Yeah.
heart and spirit of it. That's again the same point.
Yeah. I would agree with you. I would say once again using the term reformed-ish, it's like, yeah, you agree with those first couple of terms, but there's just that one, the one that nobody really likes. That one? Yeah, that one.
Yeah, that one.
It's a pretty big one too. and and it really handles on how you think about a lot of things. So yeah, once again, I would say the same thing you said with real presence earlier. If you're emeralding, that's fine. I probably agree with you on a lot, but on this one, you just have to understand that once again, we're having to make the term strict because we don't want to lose them. So there's that. Um, all right, next one, confessionalism. Oh, sorry, not no, I misread. I misread. Sorry. Um, covenantalism versus dispensationalism. So if you are a dispensationalist, can you be reformed? I'm going to ahead and to say this. I would say no. I would say
Yeah.
I think covenantalism is a big thing in Reformed theology. Now, if you are a dispensationalist and you somehow hold to a bunch of other reform stuff, I would probably say you're a reformist. I'm thinking of John MacArthur here. I would call him a Reformed Baptist, but I would call him more Reformed-ish. I don't think he's as Reformed as say like Vodi Bakum, right? And this is kind of what you get with MacArthurites, where they're Reformed Baptists. They would agree with us on quite a little bit of pretty important things, such as five solas and um, Calvinism and stuff like that. But covenant theology, I think, is just a big one to where I think, honestly, covenant theology is probably bigger than memorialism or amerindianism, in the
Right.
sense that I think it would make you, more reformed-ish, to be a dispensationalist, just because of how important covenant theology is to reformed theology. I mean, it's how God works through the gospel and through the law and all this stuff. So, yeah, I'm gonna put the ball in your court, Chris. What do you have to think about
Yeah.
this?
I mean, again, we want to be careful though, because if it's a very strict view of this, that's what's going to keep the term. And on the other side, we want to make sure that the Presbyterians don't completely dismiss us just
Hmm.
because we hold to a different covenant theology.
Yeah.
I mean, in some cases, it's framed as if 1689 federalism, the view that Reformed Baptists hold to generally, it's this middle ground between dispensationalism and true covenantalism, which is not even true.
No,
As
if
we're
anything, honestly, Westminster in theology is closer to dispensationalism, actually.
right. I
Yeah.
think you're right there. I think that's exactly it. So again, we want to be strict on
Hmm.
covenantalism. We want to make sure that we don't allow dispensationalist theology into the movement. We don't want it to become acceptable as reformed because it is very much not reformed.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what we're seeing here is there's this spectrum of reformed-ish and reformed. You have like on one side you have your reformed-ish, right? You have people who would be dispensationalists, and then maybe memorialist is next, and then maybe Amerildian, and then Sabbatarian, moderate Sabbatarian, right? Stuff like that. And then on the other side you have people who are, Federalists, Covenantalists, strict Sabbatarians, whatever, elder ruled, elder led, stuff like this. There's this spectrum of doctrine. But I think there are. I think with this doctrine, if you hold to like a bunch of these points and just miss on one, I don't think that one that you miss just immediately says, "Oh, you're not reformed at all." But I do think it is important to understand that reformed, it is a strict term. Even we don't want to broaden the tent so much to where if we just say reformed is Calvinism, then all the Calvinists out there are immediately reformed, because that would just make what, like, a mega church that believes in Calvinism but it doesn't have the regular principle. It's memorialist, probably. um, you know, they're not confessional and other stuff like this. Elder ruled megachurch, something like that.
Or even in
Sorry, go
some
ahead.
worst cases, it's a dictator led church where the
Yeah,
pastor controls it all.
that's what I was trying to say with the elder ruled megachurch. Yeah. So I do think it's interesting. I think that when it comes to a lot of these issues, I think there's a lot of some leniency with some issues. I would say that progressive covenantalism, federalism, probably the most leniency. That's what I put at the top. You can hold both and still be very reformed. And so what consequently comes from that is Sabbatarianism. Even though, like I said, progressive covenantalists are still very practically Sabbatarian. They would still probably hold to a rest on the Sabbath, more than a lot of people would. They just wouldn't be as strict or maybe have as much with it than a federalist would. So that's also interesting. Um, but yeah, you also see this kind of leniency with the Sabbath in modern Presbyterians, where they differ from the historical. Like the PCA, for example, is not as Sabbatarian as, say, another current Presbyterian denomination that's more traditional, being the Reformed Presbyterian Church, the RPC USA, is very Sabbatarian. They are very much strict Sabbatarians, whereas the PCA is not nearly as strict as they are. Yet there's some leniency there to where both can call each other Reformed. Um, so I do think a lot of these issues are very interesting. I was gonna end with this one. Um, One, Chris, what do you think about confessionalism? Do you think confessionalism makes you reformed or not? What are your thoughts on it?
I think confessionalism is very key to being reformed. It's so important that a lot of the reformed did write confessions. It's sort of like a cause and effect. And
Hmm.
with some of the looser Calvinists, again, not to discount their theology as
Yeah.
terrible, but I do believe that they could do better in holding to confessionalism. And I
Hmm.
believe that confessionalism has a very strong role in the Reformed tradition. Acting as those guardrails,
Yeah,
protecting us from
exactly.
falling into accidental heresy and other
Hmm.
situations like that. I just believe that confessionalism is just such a key point there.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I think, yeah, I would agree with you. I would say like confessionalism is not always required to be reformed-ish, right? I would say to be reformed in the true sense. I do think there is some need for confessionalism now. Um, there are some issues that are up for debate, like your interpretation of the confessions. I think, sure, you can be up to debate. Like I would call myself uh, confessional by the 1689 standard. But there are some things in there, such as Article 8 of the one on the Sabbath. I would call myself more of a moderate Sabbatarian. I do believe that there is this divine institution of a day of rest, right, where we are to rest on that day. And it is also a day of worship and holy reverence to God. And I'm not gonna leave church early to go to something or um, like
Skip church for a
intentionally,
baseball
yeah,
game.
skip church, not going to skip church for a baseball or football game of the Super Bowl or anything like that. Like, but at the same time, there's also the sense of, if your lamb, like as you just said, if your lamb is caught, in a ditch, you're gonna go get it. Like, I still think that I can work when necessary and do things when necessary because God has blessed me with that. But at the same time, it is also a day of rest from work, from the normal 9 to 5 job, right? Is a day of rest from that 9 to 5. But that's where some would disagree with me. They'd say, "Oh, you're kind of saying Jesus is the Sabbath or is the Lord of the Sabbath there more than they would," and that's where the whole debate is. But that's up for debate. So I think the first and second London are good parameters. You can also hold to there's a lot of the particular Baptist confessions, but they all pretty much agree with the 1689. I think that's a central one. So I think being confessional is very good, but at the same time, it depends on your interpretation. Other ones, Pope is the Antichrist in 1689, which I'm not necessarily a partial preterist per se, but I could see that the Pope of the medieval period could be a Antichrist. Once again, not a partial preterist per se. I'd fall more into the idealist camp. Yeah, exactly. That definitely falls into a matter of discernment and interpretation. So I think with confessionalism, we would recommend, yes, you are to have a document to set up as a boundary of some kind, and I would say it's very key to being reformed, but I would not say that holding to a specific interpretation of said document on these debated ones. Like if you hold a specific interpretation of real presence on it, I think that'd be a little weird. And some people don't say they agree with 1689 because of that, and I think that's great. And they found another confession sometimes even the 1644, though I would say there are some articles in the 1644 that it's hard to get around and to say Baptists have a different sacramental views, such as Article 40 for me. That's a big one. That's one of the sign and seal nature in baptism, which is very interesting. Um, so, yeah, that was a lot of thoughts, Chris. I have one
Yeah.
more thing to say though. I think another thing that I think kind of got in this that kind of distinguishes Reformed Baptists is a lot of the times today they're very serious about their faith, and they're also
Yeah.
very into theology,
And
which I think is just so interesting. But I was talking with some friends about this, and we kind of realized why. It's just because it's Reformed theology is just so unpopular, and so rare to where people who hold to it have to be really committed and they're very serious about it and they love it. And once again, like I'm not justifying the cage stage folks. I don't
right.
think don't be cage stage guys. We were there too. But you also
We
see
were.
this. You can tell when you're around someone who's reformed. If you know the term, you can tell when you're around someone who's reformed. They're
Yeah,
typically
for
very
sure.
serious about it. Um, and they know their theology. So
They
yeah,
probably have a library.
they probably have a library they barely read 30% of. But yeah, it's so interesting. So and then liturgy too. I mean, Reformed Baptist churches. I can't think of one that's like a rock concert. or with lights and all that. They're typically very traditional in their liturgy. I mean, they sing hymns and songs and spiritual songs. So I do think that is interesting. And I do think there needs to be this distinction between the Reformed and non-Reformed Baptist, just because of some of those facts of liturgy, and theology, like we talked about earlier. So,
If I were to add my thoughts on this, so yeah, I would say I agree with you that it is a very strong belief to be a Reformed Baptist. I
hmm
mean, a lot of this comes too from the Reformed Baptist movement, where Reformed Baptist became a term that was used.
hmm
So the idea to hold to Reformed doctrines, at its peak, it was quite a theological juggernaut. Even if now it's more opposed than it was, and it doesn't have the same momentum that it once did. There still is a
Yeah.
lot of remnants, and there still is a lot of strong Reformed Baptists out there. And the odds are, if you encounter one, he's going to talk theology with you.
Yep.
If you encounter a Reformed Baptist in the wild, get ready to talk some theology.
Yeah.
This applies to lay people too. In my
hmm
experience, this is only really rivaled by conservative Presbyterians,
Yeah.
because everyone's a theologian. R.C. Sproul.
hmm
If you look at Catholics, they heavily rely on lay people. On the lay people heavily rely on the higher ups to defend them. If you were
hmm
to ask an average Catholic a theological question, the odds are you might not get the most theological answer. The
Yeah.
same thing
And
applies to megachurch evangelicals and
hmm
other lay people. But
it,
only conservative Presbyterians rival Reformed Baptist layperson,
yeah.
in my experience.
hmm
It's just interesting to see.
Yeah. I was gonna say that there have been some studies recently. You look at the modern state of theology that Ligonier put out for evangelicals, and there's a lot of crazy
Right.
stuff that we're saying from a lot of the lay people. And you actually have a lot of the same thing with Catholicism. And you can look at some of the things that Catholic Answers have put out. And you got some crazy answers from the lay people, which it's all for Mexico, guys. Trust. They're the ones with all the mega churches. I saw this be one time. It's like Roman Catholicism if Mexico didn't exist, and it's just like it's just like this wonderful image of like a perfect world, which is also not true. There are also some other countries y'all could get rid of, that just kind of make it easy to poke
South
fun at y'all
America,
sometimes.
probably.
So yeah, the entirety of South America. Um, but yeah, like it's crazy, and I agree with you. Like, I've only been rivaled by Presbyterians, as late Presbyterians, right? And yeah, I do think it's crazy because like I love having these theological conversations, but a lot of the times, a lot of people in my own tradition, we just don't have them.
Yeah.
Within the Baptist tradition, speaking broadly, but within Reformed Baptist, I have them every other day. And same thing with Presbyterians. So I do think that's super interesting that the laity, the theology and the literacy of the laity is very much emphasized for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you shall know them by their fruits. And I think that is a very good
hmm
sign for Reformed Baptists, showing how active they are in their faith. And even if they are a minority among Baptists,
Yeah.
I think showing their fruits is a good thing. Although there are those cage stage ones, those cage stage Calvinists.
Yep.
Um, in that case, you need to tell them to be more Christ-like.
Yep.
I'm not really sure what more can be be done that,
Yep.
other than
Tell them,
stay in the
tell them to go to their
cage.
pastor. Tell them to go to their
Go to their
pastor.
pastor. Go to
Yep.
your
Go to your
pastor.
pastor
Talk
and
to him.
talk theology. He'll straighten you out.
He'll humble
Yeah.
you.
He'll humble you for sure. Yeah, that's a good
So
humbling that you're gonna need.
so again,
So,
yeah, I don't think Reformed Baptist is a bad term. I think,
hmm
closing off this question, I think Reformed Baptist is a very beneficial term as long as we're careful when we use it and we don't use it to apply to anyone who's Calvinist in general, which you do see a tendency of these days.
yeah.
All right, I think we've talked enough about this question. We're getting into a little long episode too. An hour 30-minute mark. We've already passed
Yeah.
that. This might be a new record. Hope
No,
y'all enjoy this. It's
this
more
is a
for
fun one.
personal growth, but we're glad that y'all are here with us along the way.
Yeah.
All right, moving on to our next question. Can Baptists even be reformed?
Hmm. What do you think, Chris? What do you think? Can Baptists be reformed?
I think we built up to this question quite a bit. I mean, we just talked
hmm
about distinctives within the Reformed tradition. I would say, yeah, Baptists most definitely can be reformed. I mean, by
hmm
the strictest definition of the term, you could exclude us if you wanted to. That's
hmm
fine. You could also exclude Puritans if you wanted to. You could also exclude the Huguenots. I
hmm
think Baptists stay very true to the Reformed tradition and the Reformed
hmm
heart. I mean, I would say, in my opinion, again, Presbyterians would disagree, and that's okay. I would argue Baptists are even more reformed Sempre Reformanda, we reformed even more than the Presbyterians.
Hmm.
I would say we did it more accurately with baptism,
Yeah,
and
and
we
our covenant theology too.
exactly with that too. And we have a more effective government system for church government. Again, pointing to the SBC, which remains strong in America,
Hmm.
and that's a Baptist run
Yeah.
versus Presbyterian run, which had they had the PCA fracture, which was unfortunate for them. But I
Hmm.
mean, there's still very conservative Presbyterians out there.
PCA, OPC are doing all right, but
Yeah, they're
still,
doing good.
yeah.
They're doing good. So I would say
Hmm.
most definitely we can is a good term. It's not. It's worth keeping.
Yeah.
It's not a bad term.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. But real for me, it depends on how we define it. Are we meaning reformed as Protestant? Then heck yeah, Baptists can be reformed. I'd say, all yeah, I would say yeah. I would say all Baptists can be reformed if we define it as that. If we define it as, reformed as in the reformed key doctrines, as in their interpretation of the five solas, covenant theology, and Calvinism, and also adding in a lot of other stuff that I didn't even mention there. But heck yeah. Now if you want to be really, really strict and same as Calvin, no. But
Yeah, no.
I would still argue that, you know, Calvin is not, a lot of the Reformed traditions aren't exactly the same as Calvin, like that, like, Anglicans and Puritans. You have to discount them if you say same as Calvin. Um, and so, yeah, it really the whole thing boils down to, is covenant theology, is it the type of covenant theology what determines you being reformed or not? Um, I would say, the type, not really, because of the underlining idea of the covenant theology really is what puts us in. But if you want to say, you know, oh, well, the whole credo pedo debate through covenant theology is significant enough, then you can say that, sure. But I would disagree. I would say that that's just really making it really strict, um, unnecessarily so, to where we have a lot of unity besides that one issue. Because church polity is less of a debate, because, like I said, Puritans and Anglicans, they have that distinction. Um, but that credo pedo, if you really want to make it to this big thing to where we can't have the term reformed tied to us, even if you say we're just, reformed-ish or barely reformed, then I think that's just really strict. So, like I said, broadly speaking, speaking of the Reformed tradition as a whole, yes. Speaking specifically of, just Calvin's theology, then no. Um, yeah, I think Reformed Baptist is a fine term. I think it's just the modern day name for a particular Baptist, and I think that's fine. If I for a time I call myself particular Baptist just because I didn't want to call myself Reformed Baptist. Just because I don't know. I just wanted to be nice to the Presbyterians. Now I want to be mean. No, I'm joking. I Yeah, I don't know. Reformed Baptist just rolls off the tongue better, honestly. It's just the
And
modern
that
term. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's fine. That's your opinion too. I personally would use the term particular Baptist. It's
Hmm.
not because I have a problem with the term Reformed Baptist. It's just because when you hear someone say I'm particular Baptist, you know they're particular Baptist. When you hear
That's
someone
true.
say they're
Yeah, that's true.
Reformed, they could be more broadly. They could be using the term quite loosely. And so for the
Hmm.
sake of culture, I will call myself a Reformed Baptist whenever it aligns most, but I will
Hmm.
also more often call myself a particular Baptist for
Hmm.
respect out of our spiritual, those who came before us, and
Yeah.
also for the sake of clarification. So it just again it
Yeah.
depends on discernment and situational cases.
Yeah, I think it's a fair assessment because I never thought about that. Yeah, I think I agree with you. Yeah, I now the reason why I wouldn't go around saying particular Baptist is because I think people would see a distinction between particular and reform, where we're actually trying to say that's the same thing. These people have gone and played loosely with the term, right? That's mainly why I would use reform probably. But I do think depending on the crowd I'm in, I'd be like, heck yeah, I'm a particular Baptist. Like if I'm with some Presbyterians, heck yeah, I'd say that are my brothers. They'd be like, oh, this guy's for legit. But.
Yeah,
I'm messing around, but yeah, like I do think that is there, and I do think that we need a term for to distinguish ourselves from the modern day General Baptist, because when you say Baptist, people think low church, they think no tradition, no confessions, all this stuff. When I mentioned earlier, there's 26 Baptist confessions, um, that's a lot. That's a lot
that
more
is
than
a
just
lot.
the Baptist faith and message, which is what people just think whenever they think of Baptist, they just think BFM, but really it's more than just the BFM. There's a lot of other confessions in there. And we have a rich tradition, both particular and general. It's just nowadays the general, are more, what's it called? are less traditional and they're less uh, confessional in a lot of their theology, which I think we need that distinction um, between the two, between General and Particular Baptist, because it's a very necessary distinction, both theologically as it used to be, but now even more with just how we run the church and how we exercise our liturgy and how we take our faith, right? When you hear a Reformed Baptist church, you don't imagine necessarily, what you get with a General Baptist church. You imagine, a wooden pews, hymnals and probably stuff like that, in 1689, most likely. But when you hear General Baptist, you don't imagine that. So I do think there is this necessary distinction, because how we interact with culture and with other traditions and with other Christians and also with people within our own tradition, I do think we need to have this distinction just to have proper definitions. But I see your point here, Chris, because I agree with you. I think a lot of people play with the term Reformed Baptist very loosely, and don't acknowledge the fact that, they are, yes, in a sense, sure, you're a Reformed Baptist, but at the same time, you're more Reformed-ish because of some of these certain doctrines. And we already kind of discussed this. So, yeah. And I think to say that we aren't Reformed is to just forget how much we agree with Reformed tradition. Sure, yeah, we don't adhere to Calvin's specific covenant theology, but there's a lot we agree with. I mean, a lot.
A
And
lot.
so, to kind of close my thoughts for this, I would say don't be afraid to call yourself a Reformed Baptist, but at the same time, don't play loosely with the term. And remember that Particular Baptist is a base term and that real men use it. No, I'm joking. But there is a sense when someone says Particular Baptist, I imagine them to be this like this trad. No, I'm joking. I'm digging my hole deeper here, being funny. But I do imagine them to be different. I'm more serious, more theologically serious speaking, and probably honestly, I would say more reformed. Did you open the episode with probably, what's it called?
Yeah,
The
the most Reformed Baptist I know.
most reformed Baptist I know. Yeah. I would say the same about you, Chris. If I didn't know Charles no, I'm joking.
The Prince of Preachers,
Prince
Charles
of
Haddon
Preachers,
Spurgeon.
Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the only Reformed Baptist theologian everyone knows about. Only Baptist theologian everyone knows about. That's
That's
saying
true.
something. That's saying something. There's a lot more guys. So,
We gotta do an episode on that.
oh, for sure. That'd be awesome. Yeah. Maybe when we do Baptist with some Baptists, we just talk about
Yep.
Baptists generally. Yeah, that'd be cool. All right.
I,
You have anything else
I
to talk
think
about, Chris?
nope. I mean, just closing off this episode, I think we all know what we got to do now. It's time for a new confession, the 2025 Reformed Baptist Confession of Faith. We are meeting up in. Actually, no, I'm joking.
Uh,
I think confessions are important. I think they're really good. I think the whole Reformed tradition. We want to pay we want to pay a lot of respect to those who came before us,
hmm
and we want to have unity. I think as
Yeah,
Christians, having
for
unity is
sure.
a good thing, and that's what you see G3 conference, and you see
Yeah,
a bunch of other union between Christians. I think that's a very good thing, and we
yeah,
acknowledge our differences too. And a lot of times it's more
exactly.
playful. There's the clip of Paul Washer, who's a Reformed Baptist. Paul Washer says,
I just always hate it when I talk to him. I'll bring up something and, paraphrase it, and he'll quote it completely and then give me, that's in Flavel chapter 1, page 692, right on the right, I think, second column. And me, I'm just happy I could read the book.
You're making all that up. Oh.
That's why.
But actually, it's a wonderful story because
See,
when he,
no. Presbyterians are just Reformed Baptists who can read.
well, Reformed Baptists believe in everything Presbyterians believe in. Just forget the water.
No, we didn't. We just need more of it.
He's never read John 13. Peter says, if you wash my feet, you've washed me completely. Don't need the whole water.
And then the one, look, there's a lot of water here.
Hey, Graham, isn't this over? Or are we past?
Hey, now you guys know what it's like when it's just us and you're not around.
Presbyterians are just Reformed Baptists who can read. And that's, I mean, it's just a funny moment to show how good natured the arguments should be and
Yeah.
are a model to be too. And I think that's good as
Hmm.
long as we acknowledge our differences. We know we're not
Exactly.
exactly the same, but we still are stand united together as
Hmm.
believers and as falling under this reform tent.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is very important because I think a lot of times we kind of like push aside our distinctives for the sake of unity. But no, I think it's even stronger if we acknowledge our distinctives and we remain we say, hey, like we disagree on this. But in yet even though because of that, we still unite on all the stuff we agree on, but we don't forget about what we disagree on. Because I think one of the reasons why RR just kind of stopped and why a lot of the young lessons reformed and New Calvinism also turned out the way it was is cause it was ignoring a lot of these differences, one of them being covenant theology, just for the sake of, oh, we all know about Calvinism, let's talk Calvinism, right? I think it's one of the reasons why I just kind of like started to falter, because of that. But at the same time, I still think that we have good conversations still going with our Presbyterian brothers. And we have this sense of there is this sort of revival of Reformed theology. I think New Calvinism has brought us this far, right? They brought back Calvinism and they brought all this other stuff that back into view in 1689 and stuff. So I think it is good that we are seeing this, but I think we need to take it the next step. We need to keep moving on, keep reforming, right? Always reforming. So,
Always reforming.
all right. I guess we'll go ahead and close out this episode. Thank you for
All
listening
right.
this far. This is a very long episode. I think it's might be our longest episode. Like we said, this is more of a personal episode, just kind of thoughts we were thinking of. But it's also, I feel like it's turned out to be a very, very thoughtful episode. A lot of stuff we talk about quite a bit, like Reformed theology, covenant theology, stuff like this. So be sure to take the knowledge out with other people and share. Oh my gosh, take the knowledge out of this show and share it with other people. But also be sure to also check out Solacast and Hearts for the Lost. Those are two great podcasts. Hearts for the Lost is also a ministry. Heartsforthelost.com if you want to learn more about them. 412 Podcasting is another great podcasting group. Be sure to check them out. Um, there's probably books on what it means to be a Reformed Baptist. Maybe go check those out as well. Also, if you want to learn more, read the 1689 and the 1644. Don't ever sleep on the
Yeah.
1644. Unbelievable. We keep sleeping on this confession. It's so good. It's beautiful. It came first, but the 1689 is
It's the
better.
first.
Anyway, yeah, read Westminster too. Also good. I rock with Westminster, as I said today to a friend from school. Anyway, all right, let's close this episode. Chris, read us some scripture.
Ephesians 6:16. In addition to all of this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish the flaming arrows of the evil one. All right. Man, almost a 2-hour episode. Who do we think we are? We're not the Just Thinking podcast. We are just two kids on the internet.
We are not the Just Thinking podcast. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And I'll add in I'll add in the clip in.
Oh yeah, that'd be fun.